Hey Vine Church, here's the plan for today. I'm going to lay some biblical foundations for how we think about the topic of euthanasia. And then we've got Dr. Megan Best, who is a medical doctor, a palliative care specialist, and a bioethicist. So she has thought very carefully about how we do medical care well, and she's going to apply some of the things I'm saying to the topic of euthanasia as an expert. So very much looking forward to that. But this issue is very much a loaded question. There is a lot of weight in it. I'm very much aware that for some of us, we have a personal stake in this issue, and that perhaps you have been, or even now are, or perhaps soon you will be someone who is caring for a sufferer, or you maybe yourself are a sufferer. And perhaps you've sat with someone in the past, and as we think about this subject, you're reminded of the emotional, physical, mental pain over many years that you've watched someone you love experience. And no matter what people say, you've seen suffering from the inside. And if there was a way of relieving suffering, then of course we should take that. And so we bring that kind of attitude to this topic. It's a weighty and powerful argument in favour of euthanasia. It stems from love and compassion and human experience. But what I want to do is I want to ask us to look at things differently and from the Bible's perspective on why the Bible might suggest that voluntary euthanasia is not a great idea. And I want to just lay three foundational truths from the Bible to get us starting to think biblically about this particular issue. And the first biblical foundation is this, that you and I are made in God's own image, and as such we are incalculably precious in God's sight. So if you've got a Bible, Genesis chapter 1 verse 27 says that God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, he created them. In other words, every human being, no matter how physically or mentally impaired, we all bear the divine image and are precious in God's sight. It's not just that God has given us the gift of life, but that he has made human beings unique from all the other animals, uniquely as his image bearers. And therefore, to destroy human life is not just to take away the gift that God has given, it's also to desecrate God's own image. And that's why the sixth commandment says, "You shall not kill." And as with all of God's commandments, they reveal something about what God values and what God wants to protect, that he protects by putting a law around it. And the thing he values and protects is human life. In Genesis 9, we have one of the oldest legal formulas in world history, the lex talionis, which says, Genesis 9 verse 6, "Whoever sheds human blood, by humans shall their blood be shed, for in the image of God, God has made mankind." It's because of the awesome dignity of human life made in the image of God that paradoxically, only capital punishment is sufficient retribution for murder. To destroy human life is scandalous. Not because it desecrates, notice, because it desecrates God's own image, God's masterpiece. It's because we're made in God's image that murder is reprehensible. And so as we live together as human beings made in God's image, we owe one another wonder. We ought to stand in wonder at the person beside us. We ought to respect their life, show empathy to each other, and protect one another from abuse, harm, and manipulation. Contrary to secular philosophers such as Peter Singer, human personhood, dignity, and value does not derive from our capacities, our mental intellect, or our self-awareness. No, it derives from our intrinsic worth as creatures made in God's image. So there is the first foundation, that God has given us freedom to act as responsible moral agents made in his image, but there are limits to our freedom, and one of the limits is we are not to take one another's life. Why? Because we're made in the image of God and are utterly precious in God's sight. The second foundational truth in the Bible I want to share with you is linked to that first point. Because we're made in the image of God, we're not only precious, but we are relationally dependent on one another. So back to Genesis 1, picking up at verse 26 this time, then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, and then verse 27, so God created mankind in his image, male and female, he created them. So when God says, let us make mankind in our image, there's a little hint of what the New Testament teaches clearly, that there is one God who is a community of three persons. God is profoundly relational. And if he makes us in his image, then to be a human being is not to be an independent, autonomous individual. You are made to be like God in relationships of mutual love. And one of the greatest arguments for euthanasia is that each human being is autonomous, should be free to do with their life whatever they please. But the Bible says we're not. We are individuals, but we're interdependent, locked together in community, bound together with duties of care, responsibility, and compassion. A Christian view of society is expressed well in the words of John Donne, who said famously that no man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. And he goes on, any man's death diminishes me because I am involved in mankind. You see, each person's death has effects on others around them to varying degrees, whether we're part of their family, we're friends, or we're their professional carers. Like little ripples on a pond spreading outward is the effect of the death of someone in society. Dying is never an isolated process. And we know this, don't we, that suicide, the pain and devastation of suicide on us, it rips and strikes and tears at those who are left behind. And to assist someone in their suicide, even when it's at their request, which is what voluntary euthanasia is about, is to agree with them that the world would be better off if they didn't exist. Christianity always says, no, you're special, you're precious, and you should exist. And when we see our loved ones in the dark moments as they're suffering, they need to be reminded of that. And so what this demands, if we're made in God's image with relational responsibilities to one another, this demands care. As the New Testament says, we're to bear one another's burdens. A burden is, to be a burden is to be part of the human family together. You know, a lot of people, proponents of euthanasia, often appeal to their wish not to be a burden on others. But why is caring a burden? Perhaps after a lifetime of helping and serving people around you in various ways, it's right to look forward to a time when we are honoured, even in our helplessness, and cared for by others. If we legalise euthanasia, what we're asking human beings to do at the moment of intense pain and suffering is to give in to their despair. We need to encourage people in those moments that they still value, that their lives matter, that they matter. And we ought to put our resources into palliative care as an expression of our love and compassion for the weakest in our society. God hasn't given us the right to take away life. He's given us the skill to care for one another in the midst of our suffering. And so that's the second foundational piece. The image of God means we're precious, but we're also relationally connected to one another. And the third foundational truth I want to talk about is, although we're made in the image of God, precious and relationally connected, we have fallen from that so that we don't properly reflect God's image as we ought. We are sinful. And so as Jeremiah 17 verse 9 says, the heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure. Who can understand it? And this is where the doctrine of sin becomes very relevant. Yes, we're precious. Yes, we're made in the image of God, but we have hearts and motivations in life that cannot be trusted. There's a recent American survey which shows that 49% of patients about to receive assisted suicide state that a major reason for their decision to go through with assisted suicide is that they feel like they are being a burden to their family. Here's the problem of legalised voluntary euthanasia. How could you possibly tell it's voluntary? There's all sorts of ways that people around us are capable of influencing us in a way to suit their agenda rather than in ways that suit the agenda of the patient. You know, some of the talk between the family and the loved one who's suffering, maybe, you know, some reasons are understandable. Maybe we say to them, you know what, Mum, maybe it's your time to go. And we suggest that to them, and that suggestion can come from a number of different reasons, can't it? Some may be understandable, that we personally are just struggling to see someone we love in so much pain. They might not want to go, but if we say, you know what, I think it's your time to go, they feel a sense of burden, that they're burdening their children, and that therefore they should go. Other reasons are less honourable, dishonourable. How can we test? You know, maybe we suggest that because it's costing us time and money and we're sick of caring for them, and there are some reasons that are just simply downright evil. We want the inheritance. Here's the problem. How would you ever be able to detect whether someone is freely making a decision to end their lives without external pressure? No system we could ever invent could stop family members from suggesting to patients who are suffering that it's time to go. And no system we could invent would ever make those patients say anything other than it was their choice. That's the world we live in, where human beings are corrupted in their motivations. We cannot trust each other, especially when we're making justifications for the death of one another. Moreover, think about this. If we bring voluntary euthanasia into our whole system, which is already stretched, where hospitals are finding it difficult to find beds for patients, there will be a tremendous stake in the government for getting rid of patients rather than providing costly palliative care. We're in a society where if the normalisation of suicide takes place, it would suit the government. We love our doctors and nurses, but we would be asking them to turn from healing to killing. And that will undermine the doctor-patient relationship, which is based on trust, not fear. We would turn doctors into being servants of life, into agents of death. The sick are a burden in our society, particularly the elderly sick. They are a massive financial burden. And we're living in an aging society, and we need to think carefully about this. Who stands to gain from this becoming legalised? Instead, we ought to invest our resources and bear the burden of those most vulnerable in our society. So these are the three foundational biblical beliefs that we need in place. There are more, but one, we're made in the image of God. Your life is precious. You matter. Two, we're made in the image of God. No man is an island. We belong to one another and owe the obligation of care to one another. And three, The doctrine of human sinfulness says we ought never to trust the justifications around us that life should be taken. The argument for euthanasia is loaded. It's weighty. It's heavy. It's often seen as the only way to escape pain, indignity, and dependence. But there is another alternative, and that is the modern palliative care movement. And for that reason, I'm very proud to introduce to you Megan Best, who's going to share her expertise on this subject.
Thank you, Toby. It's great to have this chance to talk to you today. And it's interesting to think about euthanasia because at the heart of euthanasia is a conundrum. For over 2,000 years, it's been a prohibited medical practice. But now, euthanasia is legal in the Netherlands, Belgium and Luxembourg. Physician-assisted suicide is legal under certain legal guidelines in several US states, Switzerland and Canada. And in Australia, legislation is organised on a state basis. And you're probably aware that euthanasia was legalised in Victoria in 2017 and in Western Australia last year. And Queensland, Tasmania, South Australia and New South Wales all have it on their agendas. We're told that 85% of Australians are in favour of a change in the law to allow euthanasia. But perhaps what is less well known is that the majority of doctors, those who are expected to actually do the deed, are against euthanasia. And the size of the majority increases as their work is more involved with the dying. All palliative care organisations are against it. So my question is this: why are we having this debate now in Western countries at a time when we have more medical cures than ever before in human history? The timing suggests that it is not a failure of medicine that has prompted this debate. How are we to understand it? Today, what I'd like to do is discuss the definition of euthanasia, because in the community debate, inadequate definitions have been a real barrier in an attempt to find consensus. And then I'll explain why so many palliative care workers are against euthanasia. And then we'll think about what's really going on. So let's start by defining our terms. It's no secret that many advocates of euthanasia have muddied the waters by bracketing euthanasia with other things which are accepted end-of-life practices in order to increase support. But we need to keep our definitions clear so we know what we're talking about. The term euthanasia comes from the Greek. It means good death. And the question of what constitutes a good death is actually at the heart of the euthanasia debate. I think it's fair to say that everyone would like to see people dying without suffering, without pain. The question is, how do we achieve that? I define euthanasia as an act where a doctor intentionally ends the life of a person by the administration of drugs at that person's voluntary and competent request for reasons of compassion. The key points to note are that it's an intentional act by the doctor motivated by compassion. It's a decision made voluntarily by the patient with no coercion involved, and they are mentally competent at the time. Physician-assisted suicide is the situation where a doctor intentionally helps a person to commit suicide by providing drugs for self-administration at that person's voluntary and competent request. In this situation, the doctor is distanced from the act, but morally it's no different from euthanasia because the motivation, intention, and consequences are the same. Therefore, today, I'm using the two terms interchangeably. We also need to be clear on what euthanasia is not. Euthanasia is sometimes confused with stopping treatment which aims to prolong life. Because in life-threatening illness, Treatment which is initially aimed at curing a patient may become futile, that is, it no longer works, or it may become so burdensome because of side effects like vomiting that any benefit from the treatment is no longer worthwhile. At this point, the treatment may not be so much prolonging life as prolonging the process of dying. And in that situation, a decision may be made to stop or perhaps not to start such a treatment. And such a practice is not euthanasia because the intention is not to kill the patient, but to allow the underlying disease to run its course. And full supportive care will remain in place for that patient, and they're kept comfortable while that happens. And in the same way, taking someone off life support is not euthanasia. It's not flicking the switch that kills the patient. It's the underlying disease that does it. That's why they were on life support in the first place. Another situation that's often confused with euthanasia is adequate symptom control in terminally ill patients. Occasionally, in the terminal stages of disease, the symptoms might become so severe that the patient needs to be carefully sedated in order to be able to be comfortable. And so this is done with the consent of the patient while preserving their dignity. And it's not euthanasia because the intention is not to kill the patient, but to just give them adequate control of their symptoms so that they don't suffer. Now, some people would call that practice of giving sedatives or perhaps strong painkillers passive euthanasia because of a myth in the community that morphine shortens the life of the patient. They argue that if we already practice that type of euthanasia, there's no reason why we can't practice the other type of euthanasia, by which they mean the lethal injection, which they call active euthanasia. You see the problem. This morphine myth has been around for years and we don't seem to be able to squash it. It makes people scared to use what is in fact a very good treatment for pain. But in fact, morphine in therapeutic doses doesn't shorten life. Some research has shown that in fact it may prolong life, probably because people are more comfortable with their pain controlled at the end of life, and so they're less uncomfortable. So stopping futile and burdensome treatments or giving adequate symptom control are both good ethical practices which should be applied in appropriate circumstances at the end of life. And when the public has better understanding of end-of-life care, it reduces the calls for euthanasia because people experience less suffering and also they have a greater sense of control. Now, I'd quickly like to just summarise the main points of the euthanasia debate. Now we know what we're discussing. And the primary arguments used in Australia in favour of euthanasia are that euthanasia is a compassionate response to the suffering of terminally ill patients, which is perceived often wrongly to be otherwise unrelievable. Euthanasia is also seen as an expression of autonomy, that a competent person has the right to choose the timing and the manner of their own death, particularly when there's so much support for euthanasia in public opinion polls. Now, we don't often hear the arguments against euthanasia in our media, but in summary, there are firstly, that the sanctity of life forbids it. Secondly, that euthanasia is unnecessary due to the availability of palliative care to relieve suffering in terminally ill patients. Thirdly, that there are negative social consequences when you legalise euthanasia. And fourthly, that there's a danger of abuse due to the slippery slope which is created with the legislation of euthanasia. It's true that many people suffer at the end of life when they're dying, And this has led to a situation where far too many people have seen a bad death. Maybe this is your experience. This shouldn't happen, but it still does, and it's an important factor for the call for legalisation of euthanasia in Australia. It's been the personal experience of many people who are campaigning to change the law. We must do better. One thing that completely changes the end-of-life experience is palliative care. Palliative care is specialised care for dying people which aims to maximise the quality of life and to assist family and carers during and after the death. Its intention is to liberate patients from the discomfort of their symptoms, and it neither hastens nor defers death. One of the slogans we used to use was saying that we help you live until you die. Currently, only about half the people in Australia who would benefit from palliative care have access to it at the end of life. Now, why is that? Well, it's mainly because the funding for palliative care is inadequate to provide very much in terms of services outside of the major cities. And it's a tragedy that more people don't get access to palliative care, but it would completely change the end-of-life experience for a lot of people if it were available. But we also need to realise that suffering is not a medical problem. It's not a failure of medical services for a lot of people suffering at the end of life. Suffering is often an existential problem which extends beyond physical pain. It's influenced by psychological, cultural, sociological and spiritual factors, and the physical symptoms may be controlled and the suffering may well remain. Let me give you an example. Imagine we have two women and they both have the same amount of physical pain. They're the same age, say they're both 32. One of them is having a baby. She's in labour. The other woman is dying from cancer. The woman having the baby knows the reason she's got pain is because the baby's coming and soon the pain will stop and she'll have her newborn baby in her arms. The woman with cancer, however, knows that the pain is being caused by the thing that's killing her and it's not going to go away until she dies. So you can see that though two women have the same amount of physical pain, the woman with cancer is suffering more. Diagnosis of a life-threatening disease is known to be a trigger for big existential questions such as, what am I doing here? What was my life about? What's going to happen after I die? Questions such as these can be difficult to process in a society like ours, which is death-denying and youth-obsessed. We don't know how to die properly anymore. We're uncomfortable discussing dying. We've lost our traditions in the West. I think we could die by example, but most people haven't had an example to watch. And most members of the public have never seen a corpse. Most people in our society have long ignored the existential dimension of life long before they have to face these questions themselves. And so when the time comes, they're scared. They're unprepared. And I think in our community, the fear of dying is worsened by numerous media accounts of pain and suffering at the end of life. There seems to be a desire in some people to go from being healthy to being dead without having to die at all. In a society that's lost touch with the meaning of suffering, there is understandably a loss of the willingness to endure it. And I think one thing that perhaps those of us working in medicine have failed to do is to articulate what's good about dying normally, in allowing things to naturally take their course. But when a person is dying, He and his family find themselves in a crisis situation. Help may be needed to deal with old family conflicts and guilt and problems that have been there for many years, but at this time it's possible to resolve those old family problems and find a new reconciliation. I can think of a patient I once had, we'll call him Harry, and I used to see Harry in the outpatients clinic for his cancer. And then at one point he developed some pain, and I couldn't get on top of it while he was at home, so I brought him into the hospital and we tried to change his medications to get control of the pain, but nothing was working. So one day I sat next to him and said, "Harry, what's going on?" And even though I'd known him for some time, he told me for the first time that he had 2 sons. They didn't know he was sick. They certainly didn't know he was in hospital. And to cut a long story short, we were able to contact those 2 boys and bring them into the hospital. And he had a chance to tell them that he loved them, that he was sorry their relationship had broken down. And after that, we were able to get on top of his pain control. He was able to see his sons a few more times before he died, and he died peacefully. And you can see the healing that occurred in that family left them all in a much better place as a result. I think the public would be comforted if they heard some of these stories. But the loudest argument for the legalisation of euthanasia comes from that of autonomy, the right of the individual to choose the timing and manner of their own death. Autonomy is viewed very highly in our society. Well, it's all very well to say that 85% of Australians are in favour of euthanasia, but the chances are that most of those people are quite healthy. You see, when people get to the very end of their lives, they feel quite differently. We did a study in Sydney which showed that for people coming into a palliative care service, only 2.8% of patients were interested in euthanasia. And once we started treating them, that fell to less than 1%. And those low figures don't surprise me at all, because in my experience, people at the end of life are more likely to want more time, not less. And what do we know about actual euthanasia requests in the places where it's legal? Well, usually it's not related to physical factors like pain, but psychological factors like fear of death, fear of losing control, fear of being left alone, and fear of being a burden on somebody. Research in Canada shows that patient desires are known to fluctuate over time, including the desire for hastened death. And that suggests that even if somebody sincerely requested euthanasia, if we'd waited a bit longer, they may have changed their mind. This research also found that when patients expressed their fears at the end of life, fears of dying, it was often interpreted as a request for euthanasia when it was intended as a cry for help. I can remember a lady who came to see me in the clinic in Sydney during the time where euthanasia was legal in another state. And she felt terrible. She was telling me what a dreadful night she'd had, and she kept saying, "I just wish I was dead." And after a while I said, I think I should let you know that we can't practice euthanasia in New South Wales. And she said, "Do you think I'd talk like this if you could?" And I think we need to remember that just because someone wishes they were dead doesn't mean they're asking you to kill them. The incidence of depression in cancer patients has been measured as high as 45%, and desire for hastened death is a symptom of depression. In any other group, a request for hastened death would be an alert for a doctor to get a psychiatric review. Why isn't this situation being viewed as a psychiatric emergency? Why are these patients being treated so differently? But given that some people who receive palliative care still do request hastened death. And I must say it's a very small number, but there certainly are some people who rationally request euthanasia. How do we proceed? Well, arguments supporting euthanasia presuppose a world of ideal hospitals, of doctors and nurses who don't make mistakes and have good motives. But we know that we don't live in an ideal world. We live in a broken world where people make mistakes and people have selfish motives. The prospect of inheritance brings out the worst in a lot of people. And for this reason, legalization of euthanasia has a number of risks. Firstly, we can't be sure that euthanasia, once it's legalized and socially acceptable, would remain voluntary. Vulnerable and burdensome patients may feel pressured to request euthanasia when it's not what they really want. Remember that fear of being a burden? And another risk is that doctors may not be able to resist the extension of euthanasia to those who can't or won't consent to termination of their lives. Now, proponents of euthanasia will say, well, we'll have guidelines in place which will stop it from being abused and will prevent these things from happening. But if you look at the places where euthanasia has already been legalised, you can't be so sure. For example, in the Netherlands, euthanasia was legalised in 2002, and by the time the law had got through the courts, it had already legitimised the death of patients who weren't terminally ill. The first one was a woman who was extremely depressed after the death of her husband and sons. It's legal to kill patients who aren't mentally competent, and adolescents aged between 12 and 18 can and are killed with the consent of their patients. A Dutch hospital has published their guidelines on how to kill disabled newborns, and the Dutch are now debating whether older people who are tired of life should be able to access euthanasia. Are these the values we want to pass on to our own children? That suicide is an appropriate response to hardship in life? Laws, once they're passed, have an educative influence. They mould social attitudes. And the Dutch government have published reports that show what's happening with the legislation in their country. And these reports show that the incidence of euthanasia is gradually going up over time. And even more worryingly, doctors are worrying less about having the consent of the patient when they decide that euthanasia is an appropriate response. Sometimes they will perform euthanasia at the request of the family instead of the patient, and sometimes they don't discuss it with the patient or their family at all. We ignore the lessons of the Netherlands at our peril. These abuses should warn us against naive enthusiasm about proposals to decriminalise euthanasia. We haven't had many reports out of Victoria, but we already know that the number of people dying under that legislation are much greater than what was initially expected. So where does that leave us? Well, let's take a minute to think about the public debate. The people who speak up are the ones who want change. Those who are happy with the status quo are often caught unawares and are less organised. Furthermore, Australian media tends to dumb down bioethical debates so that even if they aren't biased, we're left with a very simplistic black and white argument where the nuances of the debate get lost. And add to that, the conservative voice in Australia is often drowned out by the media, particularly the conservative voice of the church. And in the euthanasia debate, it is notoriously difficult to be heard if you are against the legalisation of euthanasia. And the public debate is unbalanced. We don't hear the narratives of terminally ill people on shows such as Q&A talking passionately about their vulnerability and their experiences of coercion. Another problem in the public euthanasia debate is that we're actually focusing on the wrong question. The public debate is about whether we should change the law to make it legal for doctors to kill their patients or help them to kill themselves. It's not about whether euthanasia is ever right in an individual case. Euthanasia is going to be ethically defendable by an individual if their own personal ethics support the prominence of autonomy. Obviously, you can argue that on an individual basis. And if you thought this world was all there is and your life became intolerable, you can understand why people want to die. It makes sense. But it's not so easily justifiable if you look at it on a societal basis. From the community perspective, there's a tension between those people who rationally request euthanasia on the one hand and the vulnerable people who would be at risk of dying against their will if euthanasia was legalised on the other hand. How are we going to resolve this? Autonomy, the right of the individual to choose the timing and manner of their own death, with the individual's right to security in the larger society. There's a real tension there. Incommensurable values which cannot really be measured one against the other. Is there a right to die that the government should support? Well, legally, a man is free to end his own life if that's what he chooses, but it doesn't mean he has a right to do so, and he certainly doesn't have a right to demand that somebody else kills him. I would suggest that we do need to respect autonomy, but not as an absolute right. People are more than autonomous entities. The argument from autonomy ignores the relational aspect. It's based on a very simple view of human beings that ignores all the relationships and the complexities of our involvement in society. It's too shallow. And so there are several ways we can approach this problem. In view of the very small number of people at the end of life requesting autonomy, we could say that we should err on the side of security and realise that there's a responsibility in our society to protect the most vulnerable people. And that means that we need to look after those people who cannot care for themselves, and that means that those people who want euthanasia can't have what they want, and that's tragic for them. But we must protect the vulnerable people who wish to live. People like my patients in a palliative care service. Now, proponents of euthanasia bills will reject my reasoning. They keep saying it only affects patients and their carers, but this just isn't true. It can't be. Because in legalising euthanasia, we are changing one of the most basic tenets of our society, and that is that we do not kill each other, even for reasons of compassion and mercy. The euthanasia debate is the expression of a society that is struggling to find meaning in life, and so it can't find meaning in death. It's desperately trying to control life and death any way it can. And the only way you can control death is by choosing the timing and manner at which it occurs. But we need to push back against this idea. We know that life has meaning and death has meaning. And when you start to follow through on the idea that some lives are not worth living, it puts the most vulnerable people in our community at risk. Surely a society is measured by how it cares for its most vulnerable citizens. We must speak up if we don't want this role of euthanasia to continue across Australia. We must speak up and let our politicians know that not everybody is in support of a change in the law. Because in the end, when we don't agree, there's a vote, and the person with the most votes wins. We're not pushing our values on others when we contribute to the public debate. We're using our own democratic prerogative to voice our own views and care for those who cannot care for themselves. Euthanasia is not inevitable unless we do nothing. Thank you.